The church had no name, only a description. People in the ghetto called it the prayer-only church because of the large, faded banner hanging behind the altar, bearing those two words in bold, capital letters. The words had long lost their original white color, now stained by years of dust, humidity, and suffering. The structure itself was as wretched as the people who worshipped there, a wooden shack, barely standing on rented land in the middle of a ghetto that reeked of urine, cheap liquor, and forgotten dreams. The ghetto was home to the abandoned, prostitutes with tired bodies, drug addicts with hollow eyes, and thieves who stole not out of greed but out of survival. It was a place where lawlessness was the law, and in the midst of it all, one man stood with his arms outstretched to the lost, Pastor Fiyin. He was no celebrity preacher. There were no flashy suits, no exotic cars, no large auditoriums, just a man, his Bible, and his faith. His wife, Mama Fiyin, stood by his side, her head always covered with a scarf, her voice always raised in songs of hope, singing to a congregation that had nothing but brokenness to offer in return. Adenike was their daughter, the only child of two people who had given their lives to prayer, yet had nothing to show for it but suffering. She had grown up watching her father kneel in that little wooden church for hours, praying for the souls of criminals and outcasts. She had seen her mother fast until her body looked like a shadow of itself, all because they believed that prayer was the only solution to life's problems. But prayer did not buy food. Prayer did not stop the landlord from threatening eviction. And prayer did not stop her mother from falling gravely ill. Adenike was only 22 when the sickness took hold of her mother. It started with weakness, tiredness from too many fasts and too little food. Then came the fevers, the fainting spells, the uncontrollable vomiting. The hospitals in the city did not care for faith, they cared for money. And money was what the Cokers never had. Take her home, the doctor had said coldly, after one glance at her mother's lab results. Or deposit 500,000 naira for treatment. 500,000 naira. They didn't even have 500. That night, Adenike sat in the wooden church, staring at the prayer-only banner. She wanted to believe. She wanted to kneel beside her father and cry out to heaven like she had done as a child. But something inside her had broken. How could a God so powerful let his servants suffer this way? Then, she made her decision. If money was the answer, then money she would find. The ghetto had always whispered to her. She had seen the girls in their short skirts and painted lips, climbing into tinted cars and returning with wads of cash. They called them harlots, but those harlots could afford hospital bills. She could not. And so, on a night when her father was praying for a miracle, his daughter became one of the lost souls he was praying for. Adenike sold her body. The first time, she bled. The second time, she cried. By the third time, she felt nothing at all. Each time she returned home with money, she told her father she had found a job. And each time, she watched her mother's medicine arrive, she watched food appear on the table, she watched her father thank God for provision, never knowing the price his daughter had paid. In just a few weeks, she had the money. 500,000, in crisp notes, placed in the doctor's hands. Save her. That was all she wanted. But life was cruel. The day her mother was discharged from the hospital, healed and whole, was the same day her father discovered the truth. The same ghetto that had swallowed many souls spit out her secret like venom. A careless whisper from a jealous neighbor. A mocking remark from a drunken man. And before she could even defend herself, her father had collapsed onto his knees, his wail louder than any sermon he had ever preached. You used your body to buy life for your mother. Adenike could not answer. Her mother wept. The same woman she had sold herself for now looked at her as though she was a stranger. God forbid. Not my daughter. Not a daughter of Zion. But it was too late. The church was talking. The prayer-only church, the same people who had once begged her father for miracles, now pointed fingers at him. How can a pastor preach holiness when his own daughter is a harlot? The church doors closed. The congregation scattered. The wooden building stood empty. And Adenike? She disappeared. 3 months later, when she returned, she was no longer the same girl. And neither was the man waiting for her. The most famous pastor in the city. And he was waiting to make her his wife. But how? Why? That is where the real story begins. In a wealthy part of the city stood a grand church called Grace Dominion Assembly. Leading this church was Pastor Fiyin, known to everyone as Pastor Fiyin. At 35 years old, he was a passionate preacher who talked about God's power to heal and the importance of living a good life. Pastor Fiyin came from a very rich family that made their money from growing cocoa and coffee. He never knew what it was like to be poor. But when he was a teenager, he heard about a place called hell, where people live without any good things forever. This scared him, so he decided to follow Jesus to make sure he would go to heaven. He cried and asked for forgiveness, and from that moment, he was committed to his faith. Over 10 years, Pastor Fiying's church grew big, with more than 10,000 people coming to each service. They had 2 services, one in the morning and one in the evening. People loved his sermons because they were full of energy and wisdom. Many said they felt better and more hopeful after listening to him. The church became a place where many found help and comfort. His family supported him a lot. His brothers and sisters, who were the same age as him, gave money and time to help the church grow. They all wanted to share God's message with more people. But there was a problem with his father. His dad had 2 wives, and the church believed that was wrong. They said he needed to choose one wife to be a full member of the church. Because he didn't do that, he couldn't be fully part of the church activities. Please subscribe. On his 35th birthday, Pastor Fiyin thought about his journey. He was thankful for the success but knew there were still challenges. He understood that following his faith wasn't always easy, but he was determined to keep helping people find hope and faith in God. Pastor Fiyin had one small weakness. Even though he was a strong, brave leader, he could not find a partner among all the sisters in his church. Every time one of them came to his heart, he would say that she was not holy enough or not prayerful enough. Sometimes he would even say, "God is not leading me to her." This made his mother very worried. She wanted him to be happy and to have a wife who loved God as much as he did. One day, Pastor Fiying's mother felt very desperate. She had prayed for him every day, hoping he would find a good sister to marry. In her worry, she thought of someone very special, a beautiful and kind choir mistress. Everyone in the church knew her, and many people even said she was like a spark of light in their lives. Rumor had it that Pastor Fiyin secretly liked her too. With hope in her heart, his mother went to him and said, "Pastor, what about the choir mistress? She is full of spirit, and many people admire her." But Pastor Fiyin shook his head and replied with a weak excuse. "How could you ask me to marry a sister like that? To me, she is not beautiful enough," he said, dismissing the idea without much thought. After that day, his mother stopped trying to force him into choosing someone. She did not push him anymore, but she never stopped praying for him. Every day, she whispered her hopes to God, wishing that one day he would find the partner who was right for him. Even though Pastor Fiyin had many excuses, his mother's love and constant prayers continued, hoping that his heart would change with time. That night, the city was alive with excitement. It was the night of the once-in-a-month Miracle Vigil, a powerful program that drew thousands from within and outside the country. People traveled from far and wide to witness healings, breakthroughs, and divine encounters. Pastor Fiyin and his convoy of sleek, expensive cars were on their way to the venue, their headlights piercing through the dark streets as security guards and protocol officers ensured everything was in order. Then, it happened. Just a few streets away from the massive church auditorium, a woman staggered onto the road, unaware of her surroundings. The cars screeched to a stop, barely missing her. The security men jumped out, ready to deal with the nuisance who had disrupted their smooth movement. They quickly realized who she was, a well-known harlot, reeking of alcohol and perfume, her dress barely covering her body. "Get her out of here," one of the guards barked. "How dare she block the convoy of the man of God?" Another protocol officer added, "She's drunk, sir. A street urchin. Let's leave her." One of the security men reached for her arm roughly, ready to shove her aside, but before he could, a calm but authoritative voice stopped them. "Bring her to me." The men froze. Pastor Fiyin had spoken. They turned to him, confused. Surely, he hadn't meant it? "Sir, with all due respect," the head of security began, "this woman is filth. She is unclean. She must not be seen with you in your sacred limousine. What would people say?" Another officer added, "She will stain your holiness, sir. This is dangerous." Pastor Fiying's eyes darkened. His voice was firm this time. "I said, bring her to me." Silence fell. No one dared argue further. Reluctantly, the guard stepped back, lifted the barely conscious woman off the ground, and led her toward the pastor's luxurious car. With every step, their minds screamed at them that this was a mistake. A woman like this should not be in such a sacred place. The door to the limousine was opened, and for the first time in her life, Adenike was being ushered into a vehicle fit for royalty. She didn't know what was happening. Her mind was hazy from the cheap alcohol she had consumed, and her vision blurred. But one thing was clear: this night would change her life forever. As the convoy resumed its journey toward the vigil, the security men exchanged uneasy glances. They couldn't understand it. Who was this woman that the man of God had chosen to sit beside him? And why did he look at her with something they had never seen before? Compassion. When they arrived at the church, the entire atmosphere was charged with the energy of thousands gathered for the miracle vigil. The moment Pastor Fiyin stepped out of his car, the security and protocol officers sighed with relief, believing their unusual guest would be dismissed. But instead, the pastor turned to one of the most trusted sisters in the church, a woman of dignity, discipline, and deep faith. "Sister Rebecca," he called. "Yes, Pastor." She stepped forward, puzzled as she noticed the disheveled woman beside him. "Take her. Get her cleaned up and dressed for the service." Rebecca blinked in shock. Did she hear him correctly? This filthy, half-drunk street woman? But she had learned long ago never to question her pastor, even when his instructions made no sense. "Yes, sir," she said, taking Adenike by the hand and leading her away. Minutes later, Rebecca returned to the pastor's office, standing by the door as if frozen in place. Pastor Fiyin looked up from his desk, and the moment his eyes fell on Adenike, a broad smile spread across his face. "Wow," he breathed in awe. "You did a good job, Rebecca. Who could have imagined such beauty lay hidden beneath a common street harlot?" Adenike stood before them, transformed. Her hair, once matted and tangled, was now combed and styled. The grime and dust that had caked her face and arms were gone, revealing smooth, dark skin that glowed under the office lights. She was dressed in a simple but elegant gown borrowed from one of the sisters in the welfare department. For the first time in years, Adenike felt clean. It was a strange feeling. She wasn't sure she liked it. "Sit," Pastor Fiyin instructed, pointing to a chair across from him. She obeyed, still confused. A knock sounded at the door, and one of the pastor's stewards entered with a tray covered in steaming, delicious food. "Eat," he said, nodding toward the tray. Adenike hesitated. She glanced at the rich-looking meal, then back at Pastor Fiyin. No man had ever fed her unless he wanted something in return. He seemed to read her thoughts. "It's just food," he said. "No strings attached." Still unsure, she picked up the spoon and took the first bite. The moment the food touched her tongue, she almost moaned in delight. She had never tasted anything this good in her entire life. Her stomach, which had long adjusted to hunger, welcomed the meal like a lost friend. She forgot her surroundings, focused only on eating as if she hadn't seen food in days. The pastor and his personal assistant watched in silence. When she finished, she sat back, looking both satisfied and wary. Then, to the surprise of everyone, she turned to Pastor Fiyin and asked, "What will you have me do for you?" Pastor Fiyin raised an eyebrow in amusement. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and chuckled. "What can thou possibly do for me?" Adenike blinked. No man had ever asked her that before. They always knew what they wanted. "Just rest," he said, waving off her question. Then he turned to his personal assistant, who stood by the door, watching everything in quiet astonishment. "Call an usher," Pastor Fiyin instructed. A moment later, the chief usher entered, bowing respectfully. "Yes, sir." "Take her to the church," Pastor Fiyin said, "and sit her at the pastor's seat." The usher's eyes widened. He thought he had misheard. Pardon, sir? You said?" Pastor Fiyin clenched his jaw. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "You heard what I said." The chief usher swallowed hard. His confusion was evident, but he dared not question the pastor. "Yes, sir," he blurted, turning to Adenike. "Come with me." Adenike hesitated. Her mind spun. None of this made sense. From being almost run over by his car, to being cleaned up, to now being given a seat of honor in the church, what was happening? She glanced at Pastor Fiyin one last time. His eyes held no mockery, no hidden agenda, just something she had never seen before in any man's eyes. Respect. Please subscribe. And for the first time in a long while, she followed someone without feeling like a worthless piece of trash. I had never seen the auditorium this packed before. The crowd outside was almost as large as the congregation inside, with people pressing against the glass walls, hoping for a chance to squeeze into the already overflowing hall. The scent of fresh roses and lavender filled the air, blending with the cool fragrance of expensive perfumes worn by the well-dressed congregants. The golden chandeliers overhead sparkled like 1,000 captured stars, casting a warm glow over the massive congregation. The pulpit stood on an elevated stage, majestic and gleaming, framed by 2 massive LED screens that displayed the theme for the night's vigil in bold, elegant fonts, "The God that answers by fire." The choir loft, positioned to the right of the pulpit, was lined with tall golden music stands, each one bearing the church's logo, the Royal Assembly of Kings and Priests. Every instrument was state-of-the-art, from the grand piano to the violin section, the drum set, and the electric guitars, each handled by skilled musicians who had mastered the art of blending melody with anointing. I turned to the left and caught sight of the ushers, standing in their perfectly ironed uniforms, moving in synchronized precision as they directed people to their seats. The protocol officers were even more impressive, well-built men in black suits, their earpieces blinking blue in the dim light, scanning the crowd with a sharpness that made it clear they would not tolerate disorder. Then, the service began. The moment the General Overseer stepped forward, the hall erupted into thunderous applause. But it was nothing compared to what followed. The opening prayer was taken by one of the senior pastors. His voice boomed over the speakers, filled with power. "Father, we have come into your presence tonight not as beggars, but as sons and daughters of the kingdom. Let your fire fall. Let your power descend. Let your glory be revealed." The crowd roared, their hands lifted high, some shaking, some already bursting into tongues. Then came the praise and worship. The choir master, a tall, striking man in a white flowing robe, took the microphone. He lifted his hands, and the music team struck the first note. The atmosphere changed instantly. The drums rolled. The keyboards hummed. The violinists played in perfect harmony. Then the choir began to sing. It was not just music, it was wealth. It was power. It was heaven itself breaking into the earth. Their voices carried a richness that Adenike had never heard before. She sat still in the plush VIP section, hands folded in her lap, eyes darting from one corner of the hall to the other, taking in the sheer magnificence of everything around her. Everything about this place screamed opulence. Even the microphones used by the backup singers looked like they belonged in a museum of treasures. How could one serve God in such splendor while another served him in the dirt? She thought about her father's church. The wooden benches that creaked under the weight of their congregation. The dusty floor that sometimes left footprints on their worn-out shoes. The old, tattered hymn books passed from one generation to another because buying new ones was a luxury they could not afford. Her father's pulpit was a simple wooden stand, slightly tilted because one of its legs was shorter than the others. His microphone often crackled, the speaker sometimes going off mid-sermon. There was no protocol team, no powerful security men in black suits. Only the neighborhood boys, some of them ex-drug dealers who had surrendered to Christ, who helped in their own little way to maintain order. She had grown up believing that this was the way God's house was supposed to be, simple, humble, a gathering of the poor seeking mercy. But this was different. The God they worshipped here was not the God of survival, but the God of overflow. 2 gods. One for the rich, one for the poor. She clenched her fists. Was she the only one seeing it? Was she the only one questioning it? Then suddenly, something jolted her back to reality. Adenike sat frozen, her hands trembling on her lap. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it over the soaring voices of the choir. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She had deliberately stepped in front of that convoy, fully prepared for the impact, ready to embrace the darkness of death. A quick, clean exit. No pain. No suffering. Just a flash of light, then silence. But instead, the man whose path she had willingly crossed had done the unthinkable. He had not only spared her, but he had also washed her, clothed her, and fed her, the way you would care for something precious. He had treated her with dignity, something she had long since forgotten. And now, he stood before thousands, dressed in spotless white, glowing under the golden chandeliers, his voice as steady as the ocean and as powerful as the wind. He was no ordinary man. He looked like the prince of a realm far beyond this world. Adenike's eyes darted across the massive hall. Everything here was wealth. The seats, the carpets, the grand piano, the camera crew moving swiftly to capture the moment. The people themselves, dressed in garments of royalty, dripping in fine jewelry and expensive perfumes. This was not her father's God. This was not the God of the weak, the broken, the hopeless. No, this was the God of the elite. The God of those who had everything and needed nothing. And just as she was beginning to sink into this realization, trying to understand why fate had led her here, something happened. Pastor Fiyin stepped forward, holding the microphone with a quiet authority. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of something unseen. People of God, I had a different message prepared for tonight, but the Holy Spirit spoke to me a few hours ago and instructed me to change the theme of this vigil. The crowd leaned in, eager to hear. Tonight, we will be speaking on the topic, prayer only. The moment those words left his lips, a force ripped through Adenike like a raging fire. She sprang to her feet, her body shaking violently. And before she knew it, she was screaming, "No, no, no, don't preach it. Please, don't preach it. I beg you, don't." The entire hall froze. Please subscribe. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Security men rushed forward. Ushers flinched, unsure of what to do. The cameras, which had been focused on the pulpit, instantly swerved in her direction, capturing the shocking moment for the thousands watching live across the world. Pastor Fiyin himself stood still, gripping the microphone, staring at the woman who had just shattered the perfect order of his service. A harlot. A drunkard. A woman who, just hours ago, had been rolling in the streets. And yet, here she was, interrupting his sermon. No one dared to breathe. Then suddenly, Adenike's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, screaming. And the entire church watched in absolute shock as the demons of her past, the demons of her pain, the demons of prayer only, began to tear through her soul. Adenike's wails filled the grand auditorium, raw and unfiltered, cutting through the air like a blade. Ushers scrambled to restrain her, their hands gripping her arms, their voices low but firm as they tried to silence her outburst. But then, "Bring her to me." Pastor Fiying's voice rang clear, steady, and absolute. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The protocol officers exchanged confused glances. The ushers hesitated. "Now." The pastor commanded again, his tone brooking no argument. And just like that, Adenike was lifted from the ground and carried, almost reverently, to the altar. Her feet barely touched the floor when Pastor Fiyin stretched out his hand and placed a microphone in hers. "Tell them," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "Tell them why I shouldn't preach it." A thick, unsettling silence blanketed the congregation. And then, chaos. A sea of voices erupted. Some gasped in disbelief. Some murmured in confusion. Some whispered among themselves. Some praised the wisdom of their pastor. Some condemned it. And others just watched. The camera crew zoomed in, capturing every detail. Adenike's trembling fingers wrapped around the microphone, her tear-streaked face, her unsteady breathing. She lifted her eyes, scanning the thousands before her. Her lips quivered. Her body shook. And as she stood there, in the grandest church she had ever seen, before the wealthiest people she had ever encountered, standing in the presence of a pastor who looked like a prince from heaven, she felt it. The weight of the moment. The weight of truth. Her fingers tightened around the microphone. And with a voice filled with the agony of years gone by, she began to speak. Adenike held the microphone with a steadiness that surprised even her. The congregation, a sea of wealthy, well-dressed men and women, sat in expectant silence. They had never seen anything like this. Never had a woman like her, someone who moments ago was a drunken harlot, stood on this exalted altar. Please subscribe. But when she spoke, her voice was neither timid nor unsure. It rang with a force that commanded attention. You say prayer only. But do you know what that means? Do you understand the weight of those words? A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. You sit here in your fine suits and flowing dresses, under chandeliers that could feed 100 families. You pray, and your prayers are answered, because when you finish praying, you rise and act. You start businesses, you invest, you send your children to the best schools. You move. She turned, her eyes sweeping across the entire hall. But in my world, where I come from, we were taught to pray, and only pray. Because we had nothing else. Because we were not allowed to think beyond prayer. The murmurs grew. Pastor Fiyin leaned forward, his usually composed face unreadable. Adenike took a deep breath. I grew up in a church not much different from this one. But our altar was not made of polished marble. It was wood, cracked, chipped, and damp when the rains came. We had no sound system, no air conditioning, no comfortable chairs. We sat on benches that gave us splinters, and we clapped our hands until they ached because we had no instruments. Adenike paused, looking up as if searching for strength. My father was a good man. A man of faith. A praying man. He prayed when we had no food. He prayed when we were sick. He prayed when my mother's body began to fail her, eaten from the inside by sickness. And when the hospital said they would not treat her unless we paid, he fell on his knees and prayed even harder. Adenike's voice broke slightly, but she caught herself. I watched my mother die with prayer only on her lips. Not because prayer is weak. Not because God is deaf. But because prayer alone is not what He gave us. He gave us hands to work. He gave us minds to think. He gave us each other to lift one another up. A sudden gasp came from the audience. Adenike turned her gaze to them, her eyes blazing. Do you think my mother died because she did not have faith? No. She died because the faith she had was never matched with action. She died because my father, a good man, a righteous man, was never taught that prayer is only the seed, but action is the rain that makes it grow. She turned to Pastor Fiyin, her eyes locking with his. He had not moved. But his grip on his white handkerchief was so tight his knuckles were pale. You stand here, Pastor Fiyin, in your wealth, in your abundance. You did not grow up wondering if you would eat the next day. You did not watch your mother die while your father prayed for a miracle that would not come because God had already placed the answer in the hands of men who refused to be His vessels. She swept her hand across the congregation, all of you have never had to make the choice between dignity and survival. But I did. I had to. Tears streamed down her face now, but she did not stop. The audience was no longer murmuring. They were silent. Some covered their mouths. Some were openly weeping. And Pastor Fiyin, his usually sharp, commanding eyes were blurred with tears. His protocol team kept switching out his handkerchief, but no matter how many times he wiped his face, the tears kept coming. Adenike closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her voice was softer, but it carried even more weight. Prayer only is why I became a prostitute. A loud cry broke from the crowd. A woman in the front row buried her face in her hands. A man pulled out his handkerchief and turned away. Prayer only did not stop the landlord from throwing us into the streets after my mother died. Prayer only did not stop my little sister from starving until her stomach was swollen with hunger. Prayer only did not stop the men who offered me a choice, sell my body or watch my family die. So don't, her voice rose, firm, steady, unshaken, don't tell me it should be prayer only. Because I have lived through what happens when it is. She stepped back, trembling with emotion. The hall was silent except for the quiet sobs of people whose hearts had been torn open by the truth. And for the first time in his 10 years of ministry, Pastor Fiyin had no words. Please subscribe. Adenike took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the microphone. She looked out at the sea of faces, thousands of people, many of them weeping openly now. But she wasn't done. My father was a good man, she repeated, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. A praying man. But he did not know better. He did not know that faith without works is dead. He did not know that God did not create us to beg, but to build. So he did the only thing he had been taught to do, he prayed. And because he did not know better, I suffered. We suffered. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, swallowing the lump in her throat. The first time I begged on the streets, I was 8 years old. My mother had died a few months before, and my father told me, Adenike, we must pray and trust God to provide. But trust who? Trust how? We had no food, no shelter, and no one to help us. And when my little sister cried from hunger, my father told her, be patient, my child. God will send manna from heaven. She opened her eyes, and they blazed with something between sorrow and anger. But manna did not fall from the sky. Do you know what fell instead? Rain. Cold, merciless rain that soaked our clothes as we huddled beneath a leaking roof, our stomachs empty, our bodies shivering. And when my little sister finally collapsed from hunger, when her tiny body could no longer take the suffering, my father held her in his arms and prayed. And he prayed. And he prayed. But the next morning, her voice broke, and she gritted her teeth before forcing herself to continue. The next morning, she was gone. A loud, anguished sob echoed from somewhere in the crowd. Another woman let out a cry, her hands covering her face. Even the men, proud, strong men, were turning away, gripping their handkerchiefs. But Adenike wasn't finished. When we buried my sister, my father told me, she is in a better place. God needed her more than we did. And I asked him, then why did we pray? And do you know what he told me? She let the question hang in the air. No one dared to speak. He said, because that is what we do. We pray. And we wait. Adenike let out a bitter chuckle, shaking her head. We wait. While others rise. While others build. While others take action. We wait. And so, when the landlord threw us onto the streets because we could not pay rent, my father did not fight, he did not look for work, he went into the church and prayed. She turned, looking directly at Pastor Fiyin. Tell me, Pastor, do you think prayer alone would have stopped the landlord? Pastor Fiyin opened his mouth, but no words came. He gripped his handkerchief again, dabbing at his eyes. When I could no longer bear it, Adenike continued, I went out to look for work. I was 12. A child. But no one wanted to hire a hungry, skinny girl who had no skills. And so, when a man on the street told me he could give me money to take care of my father, I took it. When another man told me he could help me if I just followed him to a hotel, I went. And when I came home that night with enough money to buy food, my father prayed over the meal, not knowing where it had come from. She let the silence settle. That was the first time I sold my body. I was 12 years old. A loud wail broke from the back of the church. Someone gasped audibly. Even the protocol officers, the well-trained men who never showed emotion, had their heads bowed. But Adenike wasn't done. I told myself it was only for a little while. Only until we got back on our feet. But how could we ever get back on our feet when my father refused to do anything but pray? The next time the landlord came demanding money, my father went on his knees. But she let out a shaky breath, I went back to the streets. She squeezed her eyes shut, the memories crashing over her like a wave. I was 13 when I was first beaten by a customer who refused to pay me. I was 14 when I was thrown out of a moving car for demanding my money. I was 15 when I learned how to numb myself, how to pretend my body did not belong to me. I was 16 when my father finally found out what I was doing. She turned back to the crowd, her voice trembling with rage and sorrow. Do you know what he did? No one answered. Please subscribe. He prayed. He said, God, deliver my daughter from this evil life. But I was not the evil one. I was just a child who was trying to survive. And I hated him for it. Because the same man who let my mother die, the same man who let my sister die, the same man who let us suffer in the name of waiting on God, was now praying for me to change? No. It was he who needed to change. It was he who needed to understand that we do not serve a God of lazy men. That faith is not an excuse for ignorance. Her voice was rising now, the fire in her heart consuming her. So don't, her voice cracked, but she steadied herself, don't tell me it should be prayer only. Because if my father had understood what I understand now, I would not have suffered. My sister would not have died. My mother would not have died. I would not have spent the last 10 years of my life being used by men who saw me as nothing but a body for their pleasure. She paused, and for the first time, her voice softened. I am standing here today, not because of prayer only, but because a man stopped his car and saw me lying drunk on the street. A man who, against the warnings of his guards, picked me up, cleaned me, clothed me, and fed me. Because that is how God works. He does not send angels from the sky, he sends people. People who are willing to move. People who are willing to act. The entire church was silent. Not a single person dared to move. And then, in the stillness, a single voice whispered from the crowd. It cannot be prayer only. Another voice joined. Faith without works is dead. And then, the dam broke. People began weeping openly, wailing in the aisles. Some fell to their knees. Some clutched their heads, sobbing. And on the altar, Pastor Fiyin sat motionless, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. His protocol officer stepped forward to give him another handkerchief, but he waved it away. His face was already soaked with tears. Adenike stood there, breathing heavily, her heart pounding. She had spoken the truth. And the truth had set them free. Please subscribe. Adenike swayed slightly, gripping the microphone tightly. The weight of her words, of the life she had just relived in front of thousands, pressed down on her like a mountain. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she would collapse. 2 female ushers rushed forward, steadying her by the arms, whispering, "It's okay, sister. Take your time." She took a shuddering breath, forcing herself to stand tall again. "You want to know why I threw myself before your pastor's convoy?" she asked, her voice hoarse. No one spoke. No one even breathed too loudly. "Because I had nothing left to live for." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, but she continued. "That morning, I woke up on a stranger's bed. He had paid me a little money, barely enough to buy a decent meal, but he was different from the others. He looked at me with pity, not lust. And as I was leaving, he said, 'Adenike, let me take you out of this life. I will marry you. I will give you a new beginning.'" Her lips trembled, her fists clenching at the memory. For the first time in years, I felt hope. I felt like maybe, just maybe, God had remembered me. Maybe, after all my suffering, my prayers had been answered. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them. I ran home, my heart full of joy. I was going to tell my father. I was going to beg for his forgiveness. I was going to tell him that soon, he would have a son-in-law who would take care of us, who would take us out of poverty. I even imagined him smiling at me, blessing me, calling me his daughter again. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But when I got home, he was on the floor, sick, weak, praying. Gasps filled the hall. 3 of his church members were with him, 1 man, 2 women. They were all praying. But he couldn't even lift his head to look at me. His voice was barely above a whisper. My father, my strong, prayerful father, was dying. And he didn't even know it. Or maybe he did. Maybe he was just waiting to die the way my mother did. The way my sister did. Adenike sniffled, her hands trembling. I panicked. I ran back outside to buy him medicine, anything that could help. But on my way, I don't even know how it happened. I lost the money. Every single naira. It just vanished. Another murmur spread through the congregation. I searched everywhere, retraced my steps, asked people, but nothing. And in that moment, something inside me broke. I was tired. Tired of trying. Tired of hoping. Tired of fighting for a life that only seemed to take from me. I knew if I went back home, I would have to watch my father die, just like I watched my mother and my sister die. I couldn't do it again. I wouldn't do it again. A fresh wave of sobs erupted from the congregation. So I decided it was better to die. Pastor Fiyin wiped his face again, his hands shaking. That was why I walked into the road when I saw your pastor's convoy. I wanted them to crush me, to end it all. But instead of helping me die, she gestured towards Pastor Fiyin, her breath catching, he picked me up. Put me in a car I wouldn't even have dared to touch if it was parked by the roadside. I sat there, frozen, thinking I had already died, that maybe the angels were taking me home in my coffin. Maybe this was the journey to that land my father always spoke about, the land where there was no suffering, no pain, only joy forevermore. She let out a shaky laugh, but it was hollow. And then we reached the church. She turned to Pastor Fiyin, her eyes locking onto his. And you ordered them to bathe me, to give me new clothes. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. A woman I had never seen before. I wasn't a harlot anymore. I wasn't dirty anymore. I looked human again. Her voice wavered. And that was when I broke. She staggered, her knees buckling. The ushers caught her just in time, holding her as tears streamed down her face. The entire church was weeping with her. And Pastor Fiyin, mighty, powerful, respected Pastor Fiyin, dropped to his knees on the altar, both hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking violently. The weight of her words hung in the air. The truth was undeniable. It could not be prayer only. Please subscribe.